Hi everyone, it's Karen here with a new video featuring 20 resist techniques with watercolors. Enjoy! The first thing I did is take some masking tape and divide my watercolor paper into a few different squares. In this paper, 12 different squares, so I could test the different techniques on each of the squares. I went around the whole watercolor paper just so I could use the masking tape to hold it to the mat and then use the same masking tape to divide out the squares. This is an 8x10 cold press watercolor paper from Prima marketing, and all the lists of all the products and links are listed in the description area below. The first technique uses crayons. These are regular children's crayons that you buy in any store, and I specifically took the white crayon and I made some marks on the first square. Then I took some Prima Watercolor Confections. These are the tropical colors, and I just added some water to them to wet the watercolors so then I could paint over that same square. As you can see, the crayon resisted the watercolor perfectly. Then I took a candle and I did the same thing. I created some marks on my second square just so I could put the watercolor on top. Then I went in with my watercolor, and again it created a really beautiful resist on that background. For my third technique, I used some Vaseline. I've used this before to resist gesso and other mediums, but I just wanted to test it with the watercolors. So I used a Q-tip and I just applied it, and I created some marks on this third square to see if it would resist the watercolor. Of course, since the Vaseline is petroleum based and it's an oily substance, it resisted the watercolors. My fourth technique is an actual reverse resist technique. What I do first is I add the watercolor onto the square, onto the background, and then I add something on top to resist it and to take it away. In this case, I'm using salt. I just pressed the salt on, added some salt onto the background and let it sit until it dried. Then the next technique did the same thing. It's a reverse resist technique. I wetted the square and then I used saran wrap to make wrinkles on top of it, and that tended to absorb and create veins in the background, which you'll see later once it's dry. My sixth technique is also a reverse resist technique, and I just added again the watercolor onto the background, and then I took some rubbing alcohol and sprinkled it onto the watercolor, and it created these amazing marks as the watercolor resists the alcohol. For my next technique, I used a glue gun and I just created a small little heart inside the square and let it dry. I guess you could use a silicone-based glue as well for this technique. For this next technique, I went to emboss. I wanted to emboss the background. However, I didn't realize that my ink, my distress ink, was so dirty and from another stamping time, and when I added the embossing powder, which you will see later, it didn't work out as I wanted, so I did repeat this again. I did switch the pad and I took my perfect medium and I just went and stamped it onto the background. I did not use embossing powder for this one. I just let it be because I wanted to show a different technique for this square. Then I took some Ranger Watermark Resist ink and I stamped my next square. Then I went in with the paint brushes. And the reason why I left the powder on the other one is because the paper was stuck onto the background and I couldn't take it off until the end, until I was done all the techniques. As you can see, for the watermark technique, it worked really nicely and it created a reverse resist technique as well, same with the perfect medium, but I wasn't satisfied with that one with the perfect medium, so I did do it again later on in a few other steps. Then I took some watercolor and I painted around the glue gun area that I had already, the heart that I had already done, and it resisted it perfectly. For my next technique, I took some wax pellets and I melted them with my heat gun. I just melted them over the paper and then let them air dry before I added the watercolor. Of course, since it's a wax-based product, it did a similar resist technique as it was with the candle. The last resist technique for this paper was using some gel. This time I used some 3D gel because it's thicker, but you could really use any type of gel. And I just run it through a stencil and let it dry. Once it was dry, once the wax was dry on the top one, I went and I added some watercolors. As you can see, as I predicted, it resisted the wax. Then I went into my dried 3D gel, and again it did the same thing. The gel resisted the watercolor and it turned out really nicely. To really remove some of the extra water, I just dabbed it with a wipe. Then I took off the saran wrap, and as you can see, it created some resist marks onto the background. Then I took the powder that was left over at the end and just heat set the embossing powder so I could add the watercolor. The salt pellets were still not dry, so I let them continue drying while I was heat setting the embossing powder. Then I went and added some color onto the background, but it really didn't show the embossed area as well as I wanted it to be and to show that resist. So I did try this in the next paper again, and I took another paper afterwards. I was determined to show how well the embossing resist technique works. So I took another paper and added some masking tape and divided some more squares. And then I took my perfect medium embossing medium and using some clear embossing powder, just used it on the background. Then I heat set it to melt the embossing ink. I was also not satisfied with the way the resist technique came out with the perfect medium alone without the embossing powder. So I took another stamp and I just stamped it on another square to show this in reverse resist technique and how well it works. I really had to try the new Finnabair waxes as well. So I just added them to another square and just created some marks on another square to see if they would resist, which I predicted they would. Then I took some white heavy gesso from Prima and some clear gesso and added it through stencils. The white gesso I added through a stencil using my silicone brush, and just to see how well they would resist the watercolor. Then I took the clear gesso and because it's softer and I was worried that it would run through the stencil, I just took some with a paintbrush and just added some circular marks onto another square. Another cool resist technique is using the resist pen from Prima. It creates this nice gooey kind of resist medium onto the background, and then you can peel it off once it's dry. There's also something called Masky pen, and that's another version of the same thing. Although this is a similar technique as the perfect medium, I used a perfect medium pen from Ranger to just make some marks onto the other square, and then I heat set it. For the last square on this page, I took a stamp and then used some resist ink from Prima to just stamp in the background. I used a white color, but this ink comes in many different colors, and it's kind of like a chalk ink, so it resists all the watercolors. So here I started adding the watercolors. First I went with the one that was embossed, and look how well it actually came out. Then I went over the one with just a perfect medium on it, and using a little bit of a wipe, I dabbed it off, and it did a kind of reversed ink technique, which is what I was trying to show. The same thing happened when I did it with the ink from the pen that I had made some marks. Then I went into the resist pen, and here I am adding the watercolor, and then what you do is you slowly remove the rubbery kind of ink when it's dry. The same thing happened, this reverse technique happened with the Prima resist inks. So in this case it absorbed the color that was in the watercolor, but I guess if it was a different color like a turquoise or a blue, it would stay in that color. Of course, the wax ones did a perfect resist to the watercolors. Same with the gesso, it really resisted it nicely, both the white one as the clear one. One of the main resist techniques that I wanted to show was using the masking tape, and that's a great resist technique that you can use, and it's so simple. So this one is shown throughout the whole page, how I removed the masking tape and it created that resist because it does not let the water in. And the great technique to actually remove the masking tape without ripping the page is heating and melting the actual masking tape, heating the glue, so the glue kind of melts and it lets you remove it much easier. I didn't, as you can see, I'm heating it up again here because it actually wasn't hot enough and it didn't melt the glue and it was ripping my page, but it did work and when I added the heat tool properly. Finally, when my resist pen was dry, that gooey ink, I removed it slowly, although I realized that I was going too hard in some areas and it did rip, but when I did it slowly and carefully, it worked really well. I realized that maybe I should have used a less porous kind of watercolor paper, maybe a smooth one would have been better, but I did go with a cold press one, which is not as smooth. Then I took the other paper and I started removing the masking tape. In this case, first I removed the salt from the last square because it was finally dry, and you can see it created a really nice resist technique. And then it was a reverse resist technique, and then I went and removed the masking tape, and the reason why it came out so easily is because I had already heat set it before. So as you can see, again, it resisted the tape resisted the watercolor so nicely, and it really created this beautiful grid around my squares. When I counted the techniques between the resist techniques and the reverse resist techniques, I realized I only had 19 of them and not 20, even though I had doubled up on some of the other ones, which I didn't count twice. So I decided to do just one more technique, and I took an extra piece of paper. This time it was a very simple technique that we don't often think about. First, I watered down the whole paper with one of the watercolors, and then I heat set it with my heat gun. It's important to heat set it before the next step, which is taking a spray bottle and just adding a few splatters. Then I took a paper towel and just dabbed away that wet areas, and it creates a reverse resist technique in the background. Thank you so much for watching. If you have more ideas on how to create resist techniques, please leave me a comment so I can include it in a future video. For more inspiration, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Bye!